review some of the neuroanatomic regions that are associated with functional impairments in these domains, and also to discuss the neuromedical and neuropsychiatric disorders that are characterized by dysfunction in certain cognitive domains. I already described briefly what those domains were. We're going to talk about them so much more specifically that this quick overview slide, we're going to move right through it. In terms of intelligence, the reason I start with intelligence is that it's a good framework for understanding how neuropsychological testing works, period. In terms of intelligence, there are three main models that inform our testing in this area. And there's an emerging area of emotional intelligence that people are becoming interested in. Usually at this point I'll ask what people think of as intelligent behavior. But I'm going to tell you that whatever you think of as intelligent behavior, whether it's the ability to read really quickly, memorize a lot of stuff, play music excellently, whatever it is, it's probably not what we define as intelligence, because intelligence is defined by what we test. Intelligence is literally defined by what we test. So, the most prominent theory of intellectual ability is the Cattell-Horn-Carroll theory of cognitive abilities and intellectual abilities. What it takes is the idea that Spearman had back in like 1904, where he said that there's this central entity, this central construct of intelligence, G, and it's genetically driven. You're born with it. You're born with all you have. And we're going to test you to see how much you got in the genetic lotto. That was Spearman's idea. But Cattell-Horn and Carroll, over the next 60 years, actually 90, they began to refine this idea so that there were multiple types of intelligence. And intelligence included things like your speed of thought, your ability to process information, your ability to manipulate information in your mind, information that you were exposed to in terms of your academic preparation, your cultural experiences, socioeconomic advantages that contribute to acculturation, as well as this sort of raw ability that's still defined within that G parameter. They then went on to say that there's a three-stratum theory. So we go from G, from Spearman's G, down to different types of intelligence that were identified by these different factor analyses that they performed over time. And then those second stratum are called broad abilities. After the broad abilities, you move into stratum 1, where you have narrow abilities. So you break down these different types of speed and other things into very refined and discrete entities and variables. Now, why is this important? Why am I spending any time on this? Because the next step is what we do not just with intelligence, but with all of cognitive assessment. The next step is tests. So once you've defined that you have this global intelligence or this global cognitive ability that you're looking for, and then you break it down theoretically, you need some way of measuring whether this theory works, or we're all just back to opinion, right? Okay. After you have the tests help you to define these specific abilities. But one key factor is that these different domains are interrelated. They're interdependent. They're not as discrete as they appear. And overall, this type of theory moves us from just the idea of Spearman's G and 7 broad categories down to 70 different types of abilities that can be measured. 70 different things that we think at present the brain can do. And this is all increasing all the time. And that then took us into the development of specific tests. Some of you may have heard of the Wechsler test. Who's heard of the Wechsler test of intelligence? Okay. And some of you have heard of the Stanford-Benet's? Okay. So my psychiatrists are on this side of the room, psychiatry and psychology. Got it. Okay. So there are 2 main intelligence tests. And no matter how you group the abilities together, what they're really looking at are those different domains. things like vocabulary, your fund of information, your ability to reason verbally and non-verbally, your ability to do calculations, right? We think people are smart when they can do math, right? We think they're smarter when they can do math in their head. So we put that in the test. But it came down to these tests. And they kind of look like this when you see them. A bag of manipulables that people like me spend all of our days giving and administering to people. And then we had to turn those tests and the individual scores that people obtain on their tests back into something that reflected the theory, right? What good is the theory if you can't prove it? And so structural equation modeling has actually helped us to take those tests, to take the components and see how they fit back into the CHC model, okay? And it holds fairly well. And the interconnectivity that we anticipate through the theory is there. Remember, though, that this isn't just about intelligence, that even though this speaks initially to intelligence, and the slides kind of demonstrate that fairly well, but what we're really talking about at the end of the day is not just the ability to empirically define and demonstrate different functions of intellect and cognition, but also how people perform at the individual level. So, and I'm going to skip this one. Okay. So, when we're doing, and for this part I'm going to talk about just the Wechsler test, when we go back to these tests, we're looking at verbal intelligence, nonverbal intelligence. We're breaking that down into 4 different domains, and then these are the types of tasks that fall into those domains, okay? And then we have to go to the bell curve. So it's really interesting because when people hear about neuropsychologists, they sort of think that we might go in and we talk to people and we do a special form of psychotherapy that allows us to think about intelligence. And to be honest, we are number nerds bar none. We really, really are. We're all about the stats, and this bell curve will tell you why. Okay, so if you were to take an infinite sample of anything, any observation, any event, pretty much in the known universe, and you were to distribute it equally, if it's evenly distributed, it'll pretty much make a bell curve, right? Now the bell curve has very specific properties. We know that about 68% of the people will have scores that fall in that hump, right? So that defines pretty much the extent of the low average range of functioning to the high average range of functioning. As you get into those yellow areas, we're moving into areas that on the right side describe people who are performing better than average, and on the left side describe people who are performing worse than average. And worse than average for neuropsychology, we describe this as an impairment, right? As you move to the green sections, you're moving out of yellow, which can be anything from mild to moderate impairment on the left, to severe impairment. Only 2% of people are obtaining scores in that range on the item that you measured. You can also think of the bell curve based on your previous experience, right? Oops, I keep going in the wrong direction. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can interpret information from this. So, if I were to take that bag, remember the picture that I just showed you with the bag? So if I were to take that bag of tests and administer them to someone, I would get a printout that sort of looks like this. It's all numbers, right? But these numbers tell me where that person's performance falls in accordance to that bell curve, which for them measures their abilities against other people of their same gender, sometimes their same-handedness, and also their age range. And it allows us to then apply qualitative descriptions to those functions. It also allows us to identify patterns of strengths and weaknesses by comparing. If you look where it says significant difference and you have the yes, no's, are there differences between their performance on different scales of the test. Is their working memory stronger than their verbal comprehension ability, for instance? It also allows us to look for patterns. It also allows us to look further into the performance and see if there are patterns that tell us that this individual has strengths in certain areas as compared to his own performance or as compared to people in the normative group. But it all comes down to numbers, right? And those numbers all go back to that bell curve. And you're probably not as unfamiliar with the bell curve as you might think. You've been using it most of your life, or people have been using it on you. So you might think of the bell curve in terms of percentiles. How many people know their percentile on some major exam? You know, if you perform